It is an odd irony of engineering that railroads are often built over the most inhospitable terrain, because often it's that inhospitable terrain that necessitated the building of the railroad. And because of that, railroads are often marvels of engineering. They go over or sometimes through mountains. They cut through forests and jungles and swamps, over gorges and ravines. And because of that, work on the railroad can be particularly dangerous. Although records aren't completely clear, an estimated 1,200 workers, many of them Chinese laborers, died in the construction of the first U.S. transcontinental railroad. They died in explosions. They died in accidents. They died in landslides. They died of disease. But a much less well-known 20th century railway project killed far more. The Congo-Ocean Railway is a lifeline in the modern-day Republic of the Congo, but its construction represented the challenges and the brutality of both building a railroad through inhospitable terrain and of colonial governance. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The wave of imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century was a period of rapid overseas colonial expansion on behalf of European powers, as well as the United States and Japan. The economic philosophy of mercantilism began to be challenged in the latter part of the 17th into the 18th century by critics such as David Hume, John Locke, Voltaire, and Adam Smith. American independence and the collapse of the Spanish Empire in Latin America further demonstrated the flaws in mercantilist theory. As an alternative, Smith outlined the basic concepts of what would become known as classical economics in the 1776 publication, The Wealth of Nations. The theory posited that market economies are self-regulating, and rather than tariffs and closed empires, the new focus was on free trade and investment of capital. New pressure arose as nation-states were established in Italy and Germany, upsetting the balance of European power in the latter half of the 19th century. Industrialization spurred a demand for raw materials, and the new economic theories stressed the investment of excess capital, often better invested overseas, where there was less competition and greater potential for return. Thus, both old and new powers began a rush to acquire overseas empires in order to exploit their markets and resources. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the scramble for Africa. In 1870, approximately 10% of Africa was under formal European control, mostly consisting of trading centers along the coast. By 1914, that would increase to some 90% of the continent. One startling example was the growth of the Second French Colonial Empire. Its old North American empire in tatters, the rise of the Second French Colonial Empire began with the invasion and eventual conquest of Algiers, beginning in 1830. The empire continued to expand under Emperor Napoleon III and would become one of the largest empires in history. At its height, the Second French Colonial Empire represented more than 8.5% of the world's land mass, more than double that of the ancient Roman Empire. By the 1870s, the Second French Empire was growing in Central Africa, largely because of the charms of an Italian-born French citizen, Pierre Savernon de Brazza. Born in Rome in 1852, de Brazza was the son of an Italian nobleman. With an early interest in exploration, BBC News wrote in 2006, he ingeniously managed to join the French Navy, as the newly established Kingdom of Italy hadn't yet acquired any ships. Brazza would become, according to Harvard Magazine, the greatest French explorer of his time. Brazza's natural charm and unhurried manner always seemed to enable him to establish friendly relations, the magazine writes. After leading an expedition into the interior of Gabon, he was awarded with French citizenship and sent on another expedition to the Congo Basin, largely with the goal of limiting Belgian influence in the area. It was there, along the north bank of the Congo River, that he made an agreement with the king of the Teke people, placing their lands under French protection. The king apparently saw the arrangement as an opportunity for trade and to gain an upper hand over rivals. This protectorate would become the French Congo. He established a French outpost at the Teke settlement that would come to be called Brazzaville. Upon his return, Brazza was hailed as a hero in France, and in 1886 was named Governor-General of the French Congo. Brazza was in many ways unique among the Europeans of the new age of imperialism, as BBC News noted. He was the only European explorer and colonialist to be honored at the beginning of the 21st century for what he gave to Africa, rather than for what he grabbed. As governor, Harvard Magazine notes, he spent a dozen years establishing schools, clinics, and job training programs. He required that all European traders pay their African employees a fair wage. The integrity of his administration earned him the rank of commander in the French Legion of Honor. Among his ideas for the colony was to build a railway from Brazzaville to the Atlantic coast. The Congo River, Africa's second longest river, second only to the Nile, is navigable for almost its entire length, allowing access to the resources of the Central African interior, except for Livingstone Falls, named by explorer Henry Morton Stanley after explorer David Livingstone. Stanley described the falls in 1899, "The wildest stretch of river that I have ever seen. Take a strip of sea blown over by a hurricane, 4 miles in length and a half-mile in breadth, and a pretty accurate conception of its leaping waves may be obtained." Historian J.P. Doughton writes in his 2021 book, The Forest of No Joy, "Goods brought downriver had to be offloaded and taken overland on porters' backs across difficult and deadly terrain to the coast, where they could be shipped on to Europe or elsewhere. Brazza believed that a railroad would open many societies of Equatorial Africa to global markets. But, Doughton notes, building a railroad sounded good in theory, but proved elusive in practice. There was difficulty in finding a route through difficult terrain, and France was apathetic about funding. A contract for the railroad would not be issued until 1921, and Brazza would not be there to see it. Brazza was dismissed in 1897 as the colony failed to produce adequate revenue. Doughton writes that he never formulated a convincing economic plan, but he was also the victim of a smear campaign by King Leopold of Belgium, who was offended when European journalists contrasted the conditions of the citizens in the French Congo to those of the Belgian Congo, where, Harvard Magazine notes, Africans worked in slavery under conditions that inspired the horror of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. After Brazza's departure, things would be quite different for the peoples of the French Congo. In contrast to the integrity of the time under Brazza, the Wall Street Journal noted in 2012, colonialism in French sub-Saharan Africa was state-sanctioned pillage, conducted in the name of European civilization, an extractive enterprise designed to strip the land of its resources at rock-bottom cost. The French plan to develop the colony depended upon selling concessions to French companies. The companies were granted large swaths of land where they were given a free hand to exploit the land and people. Encyclopedia Britannica notes forced labor, head taxes, compulsory production of cash crops, and draconian labor contracts forced Africans to build infrastructure and to participate in the colonial economy. After some embarrassing press, Brazza was sent back on an inspection tour in 1905. He died of dysentery and fever on the voyage home. He was treated as a hero, but his report, excoriating officials for their treatment of the local population, was suppressed by the French Assembly to avoid embarrassment. In 1910, the French Congo was combined with other French Central African colonies to create French Equatorial Africa, a territory that, Doughton writes, reached from equatorial rainforests to sun-scorched deserts, encompassing millions of people, dozens of ethnic groups and languages, and myriad religious traditions. Its people would suffer under the Code de l'indigénous, or nativeness. The website Retro News explains. A set of decrees rather than a veritable code, the indigenous was legislation subjecting the natives to a series of rules and repressive measures, enforced by decree and justified by the French mission of civilizing native peoples. Among other restrictions, the code included provisions for forced labor as a means to extract economic resources. The Journal of African History noted in 1966, all major projects in French West Africa in this period were performed by forced labor, including work on roads and mines and in the fields of private companies. And among these projects, none was more brutal than the railway that Brazza had envisioned. Mining of copper ore in the Middle Congo brought back interest in the line that Brazza had originally talked about as early as the 1880s. In 1905, an investigation by a mining engineer planned a route that would terminate at Point Noir on the Atlantic coast, so named because Portuguese explorers had used a block of black rocks as a navigational point. The location proved suitable for a deepwater port. The route would be roughly 540 kilometers long, a distance, Doughton notes, shorter than the distance from Paris to Lyon, or from San Francisco to Los Angeles. But it would cross the difficult mountainous area called Mayombe. Doughton notes that the estimated cost for building the line was 95 million francs, the equivalent of $400 million today. The plan was approved by the Governor General in 1914, but put aside as Europe quickly fell into war. The project gained renewed interest following the war, ironically seen as a humanitarian tool, Doughton notes. To many Frenchmen, the empire's inhabitants were trapped in stagnant societies plagued by superstition, cannibalism, and tyrannical political practices. The project came to symbolize, at least rhetorically, he writes, a new era for the colony, a departure from the days of concessionary system with its abuses and unprofitable monopolies. Ground was broken February 6, 1921. The route wasn't yet finalized, but the Governor General, Victor Aguirre, argued that we must see and act. A 1981 article in African Studies Review writes, "The work began on both terminals at the line. One group of workers started at Brazzaville and another at the Point Noir on the Atlantic Ocean. Such an ambitious plan required more than 10,000 African laborers annually." A contract was given to the Société de Construction du Batignolles, or Batignolles Construction Company, which had built lines in Senegal and Algeria. But there was a catch. A 2021 edition of The Economist notes, but whereas it had to provide machinery and skilled labor itself, the unskilled labor of Africans was given to it by the colonial state, practically free. The efforts to recruit that labor proved disastrous. While the original plan was to use local labor, the area was sparsely populated. Moreover, workers were mistreated and given insufficient rations. As rumors spread of the work conditions, populations resisted or fled. And as they fled, local food production declined, worsening the problem feeding the workers. Desperate for labor, the Governor General was forced to authorize recruitment across the vast territory of French Equatorial Africa. Something, Doughton writes, put in motion that would be one of the largest forced migrations in the empire since the end of the Atlantic slave trade. The peoples of the territory, vast as it was, soon figured out the danger of recruitment. Doughton writes that for many communities, recruitment meant, if not actual death, total loss, temporary or permanent, of kin, warriors, hunters, homemakers, loved ones. While colonial administrators insisted the recruitment was voluntary, observers saw it differently. The Economist writes, the administration claimed to be recruiting paid volunteers, while its agents forced Africans to work at gunpoint. Recruitment was further limited by the endemic sickness of the region, with communities already decimated by sleeping sickness, and the fact that many laborers were already being used to maintain local roads. Recruitment also raised the specter of political unrest. Thousands of workers were thus forced into working on the railroad, often having to walk hundreds of kilometers to even start work. Doughton writes, men and women endured long marches, from post to post, through changing ecosystems and unpredictable weather, covering hundreds of kilometers and lasting days, weeks, and even months. It was a voyage of privation, abuse, and emotional strain. Many of the recruits made the journey in chains, under guard, odd given that the colonial administration maintained that they had been voluntarily recruited. When transported by river, the boats were ill-designed, and people suffocated in the crowded below decks. He notes the record of a man named Malamele, who was recruited and examined at a medical post. He was examined several more times. Each time the results were recorded. By the time he reached the worksite, he was so emaciated that he was unable to work, and sent immediately to the hospital, where he died the next day. Doughton was quoted in an edition of the Stanford University News. Stories like Mama Mele's are the stories of empire that don't get told. And that was just the effort to get to the worksite. Those who made it, exhausted, disoriented, separated from their communities, often not speaking the language of the people that they worked with or for, were forced to work in terrible conditions. The article in the African Studies Review notes the physiographical conditions presented a major challenge to the workers. The terrain through which the railroad had to pass was generally rugged. Here one encountered thick forests, there one encountered rocky elevations, there miles of waterless dry land and long stretches of swamps. Climatic conditions tended to be extreme, intense heat from November to May, and torrential rains from May to October. Construction was most difficult through the rough hills and forests of Mayombe, something that Doughton described as an utterly inhospitable place to do much of anything, let alone build a railroad. It was French essayist Marcel Sauvage who described the region in his 1930 work The Secrets of Black Africa as the forest of no joy. The region offered unique engineering challenges, as Doughton notes. It was where the engineering feat was at its most bravura. Unstable soil, precipices and chasms, waterways and erosion meant that the Batignolles had to construct hundreds of small bridges, massive viaducts, and a 1,700-meter-long tunnel under Mount Bemba, the longest in Equatorial Africa. African Studies Review writes, workers had to dig a distance of 1,594 meters with hand tools, mostly hoes. They split rocks with dynamite, often hazardous to the detonator, carried construction materials by hand or on their backs, and prepared cement by hand. They moved thousands of tons of dirt manually and cut most trees along the way by axe and handsaw. Workers were expected to work at first 9.5 and then extended to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The article notes that informants that mutinies due to mistreatment, hunger, hard work, and salary differences occurred frequently. The land was so inhospitable, in fact, that the challenge to even bring food to the workforce was overwhelming, and work camps, despite colonial efforts to regulate them, were filled with filth and disease. Workers died of malaria, yellow fever, cholera, and of accidents. The Economist writes bluntly, It was cheaper to replace workers who died with new ones than to keep them healthy. In 1925, one doctor estimated nearly a quarter of new workers would not survive a year. African Studies Review summarizes the effects of the railroad on the Sera people of Chad. The evidence reviewed suggests the project caused tremendous demographic setback for the Sera of Chad. Some 20,000 healthy men were taken from the prefecture alone between 1924 and 1934. Adding to the registered deaths, the unreported ones, the frequent escapes, and the Sera who stayed at the Congo at the end of their contracts, the number of recruits who never returned home was higher than 50%. It was one of the deadliest railroad projects in history. The Wall Street Journal writes, French archives indicated that it caused the deaths of up to 23,000 Africans. Unofficial estimates of labor mortality were higher, with as many as 60,000 dead. In little over a decade, Mr. Doughton writes, more men and women died on the Congo-Ocean than in 80 years building the pyramids of Giza. Eventually, the increasingly violent efforts to recruit workers for the railway led to native uprisings, including the 1928 to 1931 Congo River uprising, which killed as many as 100,000. The Republic of Congo gained its independence from France in 1960 and has since faced several periods of political instability. The railroad was opened in 1934. The Economist notes that the railway was a masterpiece of engineering. For decades, it provided the only means of transporting goods within Congo. The wealth of Brazzaville, still so named, was built on it. The railway still operates today, although a 2007 BBC report said that it was in decrepit condition, and railway accidents are not uncommon. Perhaps most surprising is that the many abuses in the construction of the Congo-Ocean Railway were recorded by the French. In fact, colonial sources are the basis for much of Doughton's book. And yet these abuses were ignored or obfuscated. They were buried in legalese, or they were justified in the name of progress. Doughton concludes, the Congo Ocean offers an all too useful case in point for how the language of humanity can be used to explain the death of thousands. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.